Morning. I'm Sharon Vaughn.
And I'm Marcia Barnes. Good morning.
Yeah, some of you I'm meeting for the first time, so hello. And Marcia and I are going to do this together, or at least we're going to try to. And thank goodness that Marcia really has thought about this and organized the vast majority of it. So all the good things you have to say about what we do today should go to her. And all of the bad things you should just, file away in a drawer somewhere.
You know, of course, that's not true. But anyways, carry on.
Okay, so Marcia, should we say this, getting ready to keep your video off and your audio muted. If you have a question or a comment, please type it into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. And if we are able to monitor that, and that will test our technology savvy, we will try to stop at appropriate places and answer. If we are less able to identify those, we'll wait till the end. But either of those, please do ask questions because we really want to serve you. That really is our goal today. And you can also use the raise hand feature in the chat area, and then you can unmute your audio and we will listen to your question. So we'll see if we can make this work.
Okay. So, which one is it?
Oh, here, that's this one. Oh, here we go.
Okay. So this is the second in the series. You are going to hear some things that are repeated from what Chris Lemons talked about in August. But this particular webinar is supposed to be geared towards the initial interview, which is typically done phone, often Skype, or Zoom. I think it's becoming increasingly common where your interviewers want to see you as they're speaking with you. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case a little later on. But that is the focus of this particular webinar. And so in terms of the webinar, we're going to talk first about the purpose behind the initial interview, what people are looking for when they interview you this way, how to prepare for it. We actually reached out to a number of faculty who do these interviews, as well as doc students who are now in faculty positions who were recently asked these questions to really try to get all of the questions that we could that have come up in these kinds of interviews. They will not all be asked, but we think that we probably have a pretty good survey of the questions that could be asked. We'll talk about some do's and don'ts in terms of these interviews and answer any questions that you may have.
So one of the most consistent comments made by people that did the interview, as well as by participants in the interview, is the heading here, which is do your research ahead of time. And so you may be wondering, well, what would that research look like? And the answer to that question is, first of all, determine who is going to be interviewing you. So when you are asked to do this oral interview, who's participating, who's sitting in on it, and then spend a little time looking at their research. And for each of the participants, make a list of information you gather about their research. So some of the themes in their research, maybe, read a couple of their more recent articles and just kind of get a sense of who they are. And you can do that for a couple of reasons. One is that as you think about who's interviewing you, you might want to think about how you're going to frame your answers to some of the questions that we're going to tell you. And so, for example, if you're interviewing at a university, and this actually occurred with one of our students, in which the vast majority of the people at that university had a very clear perspective about inclusion. And that clear perspective was this real emphasis on full inclusion. And so when there were questions asked about inclusion, this student interviewing for the job was already aware of the positions of several, maybe most of the faculty. And so while she was forthright and honest about her views, she also could condition those with the understanding of the research and writings of the people interviewing her. Secondly, do your research on the department. So in addition to the people interviewing you, look into like the research of the other faculty in the department. And by looking at the department, you'll see how the department is structured. So you'll find out whether there are several areas in the department. So for example, sometimes departments are departments of ed, psych, and special education, and that would be worth knowing. Sometimes there are centers located within the department, various centers on individuals with disabilities or research centers, and knowing that might be useful to you. And then you can also look at the kinds of graduate programs and undergraduate programs that they offer in areas related to yours. And I think that relates to what Chris Lemons talked about last month in the webinar he provided. And then the last thing in terms of do your research ahead of time, and Marcia and I were actually necessitated our following this bullet, which is to make sure your technology works. It was probably our biggest concern in preparing for this webinar, is to be sure that our technology worked, that we were prepared for you, and that what we weren't doing is spending 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning saying, oh, hold on, we're still trying to figure this out. How, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Those kinds of things, do not sit well with interview committees. So I think most of those you would think about, but it's probably important to keep that on your list. And you may also want to think a little bit about the purpose for the interviewers. So why are they asking to interview you prior to inviting you to come to campus? Now, one of the reasons might be that they have a longer list of people who they are smitten with and think have the potential to be faculty, then they are able to invite. It is not uncommon for departments to be able to invite 2 or 3 people, and they may have a list of 5 or even more, and they're trying to shorten that list. And they are also potentially looking for your addressing questions that they have not been able to derive based on your curriculum vitae or your letter of application. So they might want to be interested, and this will come up again, in hearing you talk about your current and future research interests. So they're not just interested in your dissertation, but they're interested in how you might extend this into a research program in the future. And they're also going to want to be prepared to hear you talk about your teaching. And this isn't just your teaching like when you were a elementary special ed teacher or a high school, whatever. They're also interested in whether you've taught college classes. So they will be interested in both. So we think that would be valuable. They also might be interested in how articulate you are about your research. So am I supposed to keep doing this, Marcia?
Yeah, you can do that.
I am? Okay. Marcia and I try to do this in a coordinated way. So, so in other words, by how articulate you are about your research, I mean, I think you've probably had experiences in your own classes in which you hear other students or maybe faculty members discuss their research, and you sort of think to yourself, oh, gee, that person really has their ideas about their research plan and program really well organized. That's very impressive. And you've probably also heard people talk about their research in ways that are either confusing to you or less clear. So be certain that you have your research ideas and the way they are going to integrate with your current research and future research rehearsed in a way that doesn't sound, sort of memorized, but sounds genuine and integrated and convincing. So they are also interested in how you will come across to other students and to other faculty. So pretty quickly they have in mind the kind of person who fits in well with their program, and they will be looking for that match. So some of those might have to do with things like just generally whether you would be a match based on your research. They may, for example, be kind of looking for someone who does academic research, intervention research in math or reading, or they may have in mind that they have a lot of that kind of research already and they're looking for someone who does research and assessment. And they may not have specified that in the application, so there's no way you could have known, but this is their way to sort of get a better understanding of what you do and how it matches with their work. And so this whole sense, the whole idea of this purpose is for them to learn more about you than they were able to learn from the materials you submitted, but also to sort of get this idea of fit. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of like an initial date, you know, when you just sort of determine, is there a fit here? Is there any chemistry? Is there any connection with who they are and what they're studying and who we are and what our needs are? Of course.
So when we surveyed both people who interview as well as interviewees, everybody asks or was asked this question. And it's really that question about fit. So why are you interested in our department or our institution? Variation on that is, why would you be a good fit for us? Another thing that came up in terms of interviewees, when someone had come from a Research 1 university and was applying for a position that was not in an R1. And so a very legitimate question, I think, again, having to do with fit, is why are you applying for this job? And it's not the question was not really asked, I think, in terms of the person would not have gotten the interview if the committee was not interested in that person. But I think part of it was to really delve a little more deeply into finding out from the person who was being interviewed in a way how serious they were about this. And if they thought through the implications of what the differences are between the institution they were coming from and the one that they were thinking of going to. So I think these are all questions that provide benefit for the committee, but of course there are also questions for you to think about ahead of time. Why am I applying for this position? Does it look like I would be happy here? What can I do in that position? What can't I do? So it's a bit of a two-way street in that sense. This was a question that some people found really difficult to answer. And it was difficult to answer sometimes because job ads can be pretty vague. Sometimes what happens is that the interviewers will take the opportunity to lay out in a little more detail in these Skype interviews what does not appear in the job ad. So that's one thing that can happen in these interviews. But you know, if you are starting the interview with that question, then you really need to have an answer to that question. And so that's one of the answers that I would actually be inclined to sort of write out for yourself and to practice it a little bit. There's nothing worse than starting an interview with a question and, you know, kind of going, I'm not sure. So this is one that you can have in your pocket, so to speak, because it's always asked, and it's typically asked at the beginning of the interview.
And I'm also wondering, Marcia, if this could be a place where their research could benefit them in terms of showing how the fit might work. So it could be that you, in your research, notice that there's an area within the Department of Study for undergraduates or graduate students that fits very nicely with your area of research. And it could be that you are able then to use that as an example of why that institution and that department is a particularly good match. And I also think embedded in this question is a little bit, particularly when you're coming from an R1 institution and interviewing at an institution that is not an R1, I think there's a little bit of concern that you will not cooperate and be an active member of the department, because your interest in research will prevent you from being engaged in the teaching and curriculum development that might be higher priorities at this institution. So I think being mindful that they are also investigating whether or not you're willing to play well with them around topics other than research.
Yes, and I just think the flip side of that is that looking from the interviewee's side of things, it also gives you some information to go on in terms of whether or not you would, it's for you, it's your fit. Do you feel like you would be a good fit with them, given what they might say in the interview around these questions? So you will not be asked all of these questions on research. The ones that are bolded are the ones that tend to get asked, according to our quick and dirty survey, tend to get asked more often. So you could be asked about your dissertation. Really, I think a more common question is they want to know where you're going next. They want to know where you're going to take your research. And so logically that can springboard from your dissertation. So it's a good way to talk about something that you know really well to start off with, but then sort of quickly move into the ways that you see taking your program of research. They may ask you, they may say, tell us about the next 2 years or 5 years of 10 years. This is also a place where you can think about, you can use your research that you did on the department, because there might be somebody there who would be a good person to play with in terms of your research, and that you might see as being someone who would be fun and important to collaborate with should you happen to go there. They may specifically ask you, if you come here, who do you see yourself collaborating with? That's always a bit of a tricky question, because you could leave people out. So you never know, you never know. But there are ways to answer that question is, well, my research seems closest at this point to so-and-so and so-and-so, but I'm also really interested in these other folks' research that may be related in some ways to where you think you might be going, but where you can't necessarily make fulsome connections at this point. So that to me is always a tricky one to ask, and I find in interviews it's always a tricky one for people to answer. They may ask you, I think increasingly, people are wondering how you're going to fund your research. So be prepared to actually have done some research on what you want your program of research to look like, and what the likely funding sources are for that. Here, a little bit of specificity actually can help. So instead of saying just NIH or just IES, being a little more specific. I see myself, applying for the Early Career Research Award, probably with a goal to do something like X, Y, and Z. So the more you can convince people that you have thought about this deeply, I think it gives them confidence that you are serious about this and that you understand where you're going. They might ask you about your publishing plan. That to me is one that I have heard less of, but some people do ask it. Also, something that I hear less of but has been asked of some of the folks who were interviewed is, what research methodologies are you trained in? Teaching questions, this is really where doing your research on the department ahead of time is really important. Looking at all those programs the courses that are taught at the master's, undergraduate levels in particular, and also the doc levels. But, you know, it's interesting to me, the specificity sometimes of these questions. They may say to you, you know, what course do you see yourself teaching here? Well, of course, in order to answer that question, you have to know what the courses are. So do that kind of research. They'll want to know what your teaching experience is, if it's if they have questions from your CV, and if you've taught any courses. Also, this is an opportunity to talk about any college teaching courses that you might have done. They can get as specific as, you know, what materials or textbooks would you use to teach a course on early literacy to undergraduates? So you kind of have to be aware that somebody might ask you this kind of question. And if you're kind of searching around for answers, that's not such a good thing. So you may never be asked this kind of question, but just in case you are, it would typically be in your area of expertise. Some people want to know about your teaching approach or philosophy. So to have thought about that, sometimes I think some of the college teaching courses can help you with that. You know, you will have already broached those questions for yourself in terms of your philosophy of teaching and your approach. So you can maybe rely on some of what you've learned in courses, but also rely on what you have learned by actually teaching some courses. Have you done so? This is a more frequent option. A couple of people who have interviewed recently, where there is a large online presence for some of their programs, they were asked, what experience do you have with online courses? So I think you have to be honest in answering that question, but it could be a question that comes up. Whether you've supervised student teachers or interns, and also what's your approach to mentoring in terms of both undergraduates and graduate students.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's really well done. I'm not seeing any questions, but should we just pause and for just 1 minute and see if anyone does have questions? So if you do, would you just unmute your phone to ask them? And if you don't, we will just power on. Power on?
Yes, I would like to say something though before we power on, which I don't think it appears on the slides, but something that is probably important to think about, and that is the importance of pauses.
Long ones.
Long pauses. So one, if you read any materials, and we have a reading that you can take a look at, one of the suggestions is when you give your answer to a question to not, stop, pause, and let the interviewer ask a question, for example, for follow-up, before you go on to answer another question, or before they go on to ask a second part to the question. So those pauses can be very helpful to you.
And also I would add that it's sort of the Goldilocks effect. You don't want to talk too much when you're asked a question, and you don't want to talk too little when you ask a question, when you're asked a question. And one way to do that, I think, is the pause method. So you can try to give your best, clearest response, and if you wait just a few seconds and they go on and ask another question, or if you wait a few seconds and you get a sense they want you to say more, then you can say more. So I think that pausing can serve in both of those roles. So one of the things that came up with people that had participated in these interviews is some more personal kinds of questions that were asked. So things like, what do you see as your biggest weakness? And, you know, this is so tricky. So you can't say, well, I'm not a very good researcher. Or you can't say, I'm a novice researcher, I'm just getting started. But so I do find the biggest weakness a difficult question to answer, but you might want to think a little bit about how to frame that answer so you don't say something like, well, you know, I've been successful in all of my graduate work, and so I really can't come up with a weakness. I think you would be wiser to think of an area, for example, if you're trained as a quantitative researcher, you might say, you know, I've taken numerous classes in quantitative research and I have a lot of experience and I hope expertise in that area that I can use as a tool to help me with my research. And I am just initiating my understanding in single case design. And although I've read many single case designs and I've taken a class, I am looking forward to further developing my expertise. So that way you're not sort of framing yourself as weak in an area, but you're also not saying there's nothing I don't know. And then you could even get personal questions that aren't about your strengths or weaknesses in terms of your academic success or potential therein, but you could get questions about how you handle personal issues, such as a conflict with a colleague, and how did you address this conflict? Now, again, as I think Marcia clearly stated several times, these are questions that people have gotten, and we don't know that you will, but you might be ready for some of these more personal questions. And there's also these sort of philosophical or ideological questions, such as, what do you think some of the critical issues in the field of special education are? And how could we go about addressing those? And what questions, and excuse me, you might also have questions that have to do with your ability to be a skeptic. So for example, it's entirely possible that they look at your vita, or maybe even are familiar with your advisor, and they ask you questions to see whether you have sort of a healthy skeptical view of the work, or whether you're sort of an evangelist. And I'm sure in all of your training programs, you are aware of the difference between those two. And it's important to sort of be prepared that someone might ask you a question related to your work or your advisor's work, and try to determine whether you are able to look at this with what we would call sort of an empirical mindset. And you also need to be a little bit of what Marcia calls a mind reader, to know the intent behind the person's questions. So, you know, if you can kind of sense that the reason they're asking you this is because they looked at your vita and all of your research was based on a database that belonged to your advisor. And so they may ask, you know, how independent you perceive yourself being as you develop your own research agenda. So these are just questions where you just sort of have to figure out, why are they asking me that? And then straight out of left field, there were some questions that many interviewers got that there was no way to prepare for, and you may too. So for example, you may get something like, what is your theoretical view of, and it could be just about anything, but for example, inclusion, or what is your position on RTI and do you think it's effective? Again, sometimes trying to interpret the intent of the interviewer by doing research ahead of time on the faculty and their research interests will help. And sometimes they just want to know, do you have any other interests? Do you have any hobbies, etc.?
So we thought we'd also put up a few questions that are clearly illegal questions to ask. Truthfully, you are more likely to get these questions in one-on-one interviews when you go to when you go for an in-person interview. I think there's something about the committee or peer structure of the online interview that really makes people behave themselves and not ask questions that they're not supposed to ask. But we thought we would cover a little bit of this because it could come up. Some of these interviews are done with one or two people instead of, you know, the more often sort of 3, 4, 5. And they could come up, as we said, in your one-on-one meetings. So people are not allowed to ask you personal questions like your marriage or family status, your race, your religion, national origin, disability status, sexual orientation. This is another one that we added. I mean, it's not against the law in a sense, but it is sort of against it's against, in terms of academia, it's really against the rules, I would say, our unwritten rules. You should not be asked where else you are interviewing. You know, sometimes you will be asked these questions, and so more for the in-person interview, I think it's probably worth thinking a little bit about how you would address those questions should they come up. And again, I think that intent is important to think about here. Sometimes people are just making conversation, but technically these are out of bounds, these questions. In the last year or two, we were also told that there are new types of questions that are being asked. And I personally had not seen these before. So I think this is interesting. And you may be looking at job ads where the job ads actually say something about this and ask you to address it in your letter, in your application materials. And so these are also become fair questions for you in this initial interview process. Your definition of social justice, what's your prior experience with diverse populations, and how would you promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at this university, school, or department? Again, if your job is a little easier here, if this was part of the application material, so you will have written about these things, or at least some of these things in your cover letter. But even if you haven't, these are fair game in terms of the questions that you could be asked. So they're worth thinking about. So now we'll talk about some do's and don'ts in terms of the interview process.
Okay, well, some of these I'm hoping you already know. So you already know that when you're doing this interview, whether it's phone, Skype, Zoom, whatever, you know you need to be completely alone. So you need to schedule this where you don't have any friends, your family's not there, you don't have your dog barking in the background, you know, your cat doesn't jump on the computer while you're doing this. So find, you know, a quiet spot, situate yourself at a desk or flat surface, and actually think about, if it's being videoed, think about what's in the background. You know, it's like, it can be kind of awkward, you know, if you have your unmade bed in the background. So, you know, do be mindful of those things. Be sure you don't have any distractions. Like if you have your phone there, you know, be sure that you let people who text you often know that this is a no text time, or else have your phone you know, silenced. And also, you know, you might wonder how to dress. And so you might work remotely in your pajamas, but you don't want to interview remotely in your pajamas. So think about dressing in something that would be pretty similar to what you would wear if you were actually interviewing in person. And the likelihood they are going to say this to you, just like Marcia and I did earlier, what questions do you have? At least have one question prepared. So there are some safe questions, like if you're interviewing in an R1, you can ask about whether there's a research office to facilitate your successful submission of and management of research grants if you are funded. If you're at a teaching institution, you can ask questions about whether there are supports to enhance your innovation in teaching. So just have a couple of questions or one question available. This is not a time where you ask questions about, now what's the salary range again? That would not be appropriate. So make them what we think of as safe questions. And have your cheat sheet, like after you, as we talked about getting ready, have your cheat sheet about who all the people are in the infrastructure of the department and all the areas for undergraduate and graduate training. Have that ready and have that available so you're not like doing this where you're looking away to look it up or going through a bunch of papers and trying to figure out what your ideas were. So, and also try to look as natural as possible. Don't like turn into a robot and, get very frigid or formal in your presentation. Try to be as real as you can, as though you're sitting across from them. And since you're probably going to be asked about your dissertation, or at least your line of research, have 2 or 3 findings ready from your dissertation that you have learned from presenting it are kind of pithy, but also ones that would be interesting. And then also have prepared 2 or 3 lines of research you're going to pursue, and have some understanding of the names, roles, and the research of people interviewing you, in particular faculty that are going to be there.
And so some of the things not to do are, again, they're pretty common sense. But we've experienced these things
Yes.
a few times.
Yes.
So don't be late. Your interviewers might be late if they stacked up these
Yeah, that's true.
interviews, but you can't afford to be late. So just sort of stay by your computer and wait for them to call until they, even if they're 10 or 15 minutes late. One thing that is so common is this sort of rambling answer to questions. It's really annoying when you're interviewing someone, when what the person has, the important thing that the person has had to say to answer your question was said in the first minute, and then it just sort of keeps going on. And that's why, and that's a pretty normal thing to have happen, I think, particularly when you're nervous. And so that's why it really helps to practice these sort of short answers to likely questions that you're going to get, so that you don't go on and on. Again, the Goldilocks principle, don't be too casual and don't be too formal, don't talk too much, don't talk too little. Someone with a flat affect, that sort of flat affect will come across in spades in an interview. So you don't want to have a very sort of flat affect, but you don't want to be laughing and all the time
Silly.
either, being silly. Yeah, so it's really this balancing act of being friendly, conversational, serious. I think those are some of the characteristics that are positive characteristics when we're interviewing potential faculty. Don't ask some types of questions. So these are not safe questions. What's the leadership like in your department, in your college? Do you guys get along with each other? Sometimes those things, if people are particularly proud of how collegial their faculty are, they will say that to you, but I would never ask it. Don't ask those questions. And certainly don't ask at this point about spousal hiring.
Mm-hmm.
The other main, really important thing about these interviews is to not be negative. So don't be negative about where you're coming from. Don't be negative about their department or their institution. Like, I notice you only have one other literacy position. To sort of frame it that way is a negative way to frame it, because it suggests that they should have more.
Mhm.
This is a bit of a tough one. Don't be negative about your own work or your own dissertation. I think as we're training, we are trained to see things through a very critical lens. And that's a good thing, but it's a lens we also learn to apply. It's a lens we learn to apply to our own work as well as the work of others. But in these interviews, you kind of have to drop that, what's called the graduate student mode. And you don't have to say everything's wonderful and there's no problems, but try to frame any critiques or things that you think about your own work that you think personally are not that strong. Frame them as the next thing you want to look at. So always do this positive framing and do it throughout, regardless of whether you're talking about teaching or research or anything else in the interview. So one resource that a couple of people have told us about that they found helpful is it's a blog called The Professor Is In by Karen Kelsky. And I think she's actually or was a professor of social work. But if you look through what she says about in-person and Skype interviews, it'll ring a lot of bells for you in terms of special ed as well. These are general principles. She has collected her blog posts into a book, so that is also available. But you can just go on and Google Rocking the Phone Skype interview and take a look at some of the things that we've talked about, but there's also some other information in that as well.
Okay, well, I think we are probably on pause for our job, and we want to hear from you. So not just questions, but if you have comments or experiences that you think are important to present, or they don't even have to be important, they can just be that helpful to others, now's the time.
Hi there, this is Sam from Vanderbilt. I was just wondering, 'cause you spoke about having a couple, 2 to 3 sort of cheat sheets or main points to have about your dissertation findings. And I think I speak for more than just myself, but I'm hoping that these phone interviews happen before I have dissertation findings. And so I'm wondering what the best approach to answering questions related to dissertation when you are ABD, how you might go through answering those questions, whether you should state the current state of your dissertation or focus on other research projects where you do have findings to discuss, maybe a combination of both.
I mean, I think if they ask about your research, then it makes sense to talk about what you have done and those findings and what you're doing. If they specifically ask about your dissertation, then I think it is valuable to tell them where you are in the process and to tell them what your hypotheses are. So I think it's fine to say things like, I have completed all of my data collection and I'm in the process of analyzing it now. So the findings I would present would be preliminary. Don't say I haven't analyzed my data at all. That is, I will tell you right now, that is a ship sinker. So I'm in the process of examining the findings. And so anything I would say would be preliminary. So instead, what I would like to do is talk a little bit about my rationale for the study or something, just reframe it. But do tell them where you are in the process if they ask you specifically about your dissertation.
And if your dissertation has grown out of your qualifying paper or your major area paper, and that is, has been submitted, or you have findings from that, then I think that's also something that you can talk about as part of the rationale. But it's not just a promissory note, it's that work has already been done.
Perfect, thank you.
And if you don't have your dissertation completed, I have also found it satisfying to people to know if you have it scheduled. So if you have your dissertation defense scheduled, and you can tell them, it's scheduled for, the middle of February, that also is a comfort to people who are considering people who are ABD.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Amanda or Caitlin, anyone else? Christy, Sam?
This is Caitlin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
So my one question is, are most of these interviews done on a video-based platform like a Skype or a Zoom, or are some of them done on a phone call where you can't see the other person?
I think most of them these days are done through video conferencing.
Okay.
I don't know very many. I mean, I think in another era they were done by phone. But one reason that they're done through video conferencing is that that's a way for the committee to really get a much better impression of who you are. It's just having that, laying eyes on the person instead of just hearing them speak can be quite important, because even if it's unconscious on the part of the interviewers, they are processing that audio visual information about you just as they would in a personal interview.
Yeah. And that makes me feel better. I know I've been on some phone calls before where there are multiple people, and sometimes it can be hard to gauge who's about to speak or say something. And so it gets a little clunkier without the video. So
yes, you're right. It is much easier for everyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions.
Hi, this is Amanda.
Hi, Amanda.
I was wondering, do you always know ahead of time who you'll be interviewing with, or should you just be prepared for everyone in the department?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah. You may know because you may get an email that essentially says, we are going to interview at such and such a time. So, but you may not.
You can also sometimes tell by who's invited. So like if you look at the invitation list for the Zoom or the Skype,
yeah,
sometimes you can determine based on that if the list is hidden or not disclosed in the email. It's typically disclosed in the invite for the Skype or Zoom interview.
Yeah, and the other way, one of the suggestions in the in the blog post is, if you don't feel comfortable asking the person who seems to be the chairman of the committee, you can always reach out to the department administrative person to do that. But oftentimes it's going to be in these people are going to be CC'd so that they know when the interview is as well. It could be that the chair also gets CC'd, the chair of the department also gets CC'd sometimes. Most of the time, the chair is not part of the interview process. But they could be. So if they're copied, then I would also do some research on that person.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
This is Sam from Vanderbilt again. This is maybe a silly question, but I just am wondering what the typical social norms are after the phone interview. Is the expectation, would it be a good idea for us to write thank you notes or things like that?
Not really. People do. I have to say that I don't know if I'm an outlier, but I tend to ignore them because the next part of the process is for The next part of the process is for the on-campus interviews. And so writing a note afterwards is not, it's sort of neither here nor there. I don't know, Sharon, do you have a
No,
other point of view?
I don't think you need to do that. And you certainly don't need to do anything that even gets close to the arena of being a pest. So, you know, asking questions about when they're going to make a decision. Can you tell me how many people you're interviewing? Anything like that is completely off limits. You just have to assume that they will tell you when they're ready. And after the interview, you probably won't get very much feedback. You might get a thank you for joining the interview. You may not get that. And don't overinterpret either one. Don't overinterpret the thank you as meaning you're probably going to be a finalist. Don't overinterpret the no comment afterwards as meaning you're not a finalist. And if you are not a finalist, do not personalize that. You must believe me about this. There are many reasons groups, departments, interviewers decide on particular individuals that are likely not to have anything to do with your performance. So you can self-critique as a mechanism for improving, but you may not interpret their response by not getting back to you or inviting you as an indication that you didn't do well. It may mean nothing at all.
Yeah, I would like to really underline that based on really our experiences as well as what some of the faculty interviewers told us in our survey, which is that oftentimes one of the most important considerations has to do with fit.
Yeah.
And there's not very much you can do about that. So sometimes a committee might look at, you know, they really like 6 people, and really only 4 of them are a really, really good fit. But they want to give those other 2 people, one of them could be you, who they really like the CV. They're, you know, they're not sure about the fit, but it's really a positive thing in that case, should you be interviewed. But like Sharon said, it's that part of the process is hidden from you. And do not assume that you did not do well on your interview if you do not get invited.
We have time for one more question or comment. So what do you think, Marcia? Do we give them enough wait time?
We'll sign off now, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Luck with your interviews. Can you press on the actual application and probably find it? Sorry.
Okay.